Alright, let's finish this series. Operation Red Dog was conceived, planned, and botched in the late 70s, early 80s, 40 years ago. The prison sentences the mercs received were relatively short. The little people, the grunts, members of the group that didn't take part in the organization and planning, mostly ended up having semi-normal lives. Bill Waldrop, the guy who used to be a president of a chapter of the Patriotic American Youth Organization, lived in the same house in Mississippi that he left when he set off for Dominica. Well, if we could do it all over again, I guess we'd probably all wind up making worse mistakes than we did the first time, he says. He passed away in 2015. The pathological sayer of the N-word, George Malveni, worked as an environmental scientist at the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, he drove down the next day to help out. Ex-police chief Chris Anderson learned wielding in prison and opened a shop in Wichita when he got out. He has since changed his name and moved to a small town in Colorado where he lived in an RV. Shit happens, he says. It's all in the past. Former security guard turned mercenary Mike Norris went to work at his family's convenience store in Alabama. He became overweight and died of a heart attack at the age of 45. Larry Jacklin worked at his family's construction business in Ontario. He never talked about what happened and tried to forget the whole thing. On August 31, 2002, Jacklin and his friend were riding their motorcycles when a poplar tree fell across the road. The bikes hit the tree at full speed. Neo-Nazi Vietnam vet Bob Pritchard was treated for post-traumatic stress disorder. He then left the right wing, married, and had a son, who also served in the army. Charles Yanover had a number of criminal adventures. After serving sentences for the Dominica coup, the Korean assassination plot, and the bombing of the popular RV disco in Toronto, he got out of prison and started selling guns again. Pistols and submachine guns equipped with silencers, with their serial numbers removed. Eventually, he sold a bunch of guns to undercover cops. He was sentenced to 9 years. The National Parole Board reviewed his case, and they came to the conclusion that there was a high risk the 61-year-old would re-offend. His parole was denied. What happened to his boss in the mob? Well, on November 13, 1983, Paul Volpe was found dead in the trunk of his wife's BMW at Pearson International Airport. David Duke had an unsuccessful political career. In 1988, Duke participated in the Democratic presidential primaries, but failed to gain much traction. He then became the presidential nominee of the Populist Party. In 2002, Duke pled guilty to felony fraud. He defrauded his political supporters by pretending to be in dire financial straits and asking them for money to help him pay for basic necessities. This was a lie. Duke was financially secure, and he used his supporters' money for gambling. He served a 15-month sentence at the Federal Correction Institution in Texas. In September 2005, Dr. Duke received a PhD in history from a private university in Ukraine. Duke's doctoral thesis was titled Zionism and a Form of Ethnic Supremacism. However, this PhD program was not recognized by the Ukrainian state as legitimate, so Duke's diploma is not a real academic degree. The Serbian-Canadian Nazi Don Andrews still lives in Toronto. The city laws were changed specifically because of him. Andrews came in distant second in the 1974 mayoral elections, but that scared council enough to change the law from where the runner-up would take the mayor's place if the position became vacant between elections to one where council gets to choose the replacement. Running for mayor is Don Andrews' shtick. He made multiple attempts, the last one as recently as 2014. In the early February 2015, a house that belonged to Arnie Polly and Denise Kelly was completely destroyed by fire. Both residents were initially reported missing. Eventually, 2 bodies were recovered. Captain Mike Howell and the Manana rode out Hurricane Katrina on Lake Pontchartrain. He spent a lot of time in the New Orleans Yacht Club aboard his ship with a cat and 4 stray dogs. His website had a message to the medic who saved him back in Vietnam. Since April 13, 1967, I have wanted to thank a lady, nurse or doctor, who overrode the rest of the trauma room in an aid station in the tri-border area of Vietnam and wasted the blood to save my life. I'm not trying to make this about me, rather I want simply to speak to this lady who literally had my life in her heart and hands and acted to help me, even though it looked like it might be a waste of time and blood. I can really identify with Private Ryan in the movie as he stood over the captain's grave and tried to reconcile his feelings for being saved. I want to share my feelings to this lady while we're both still alive. If anyone might be interested in helping me find and thank this lady for her role in saving my life, please help me find her so I can thank her and let her know that we have affected Western Hemisphere politics for the better. Captain Mike passed away in 2011. His website, manana.com, went offline in 2019. I guess he never did find that woman. The ATF, FBI, and US Customs continued to uncover coup attempts out of New Orleans. In 1984, police arrested 13 men in a motel room in Slidell as they were meeting to plan an invasion of Haiti. 2 years later, some people were arrested as they were leaving for Suriname to overthrow the local government. After doing time, Mike Perdue returned to Texas and almost immediately launched a new scam. Can't subdue the Perdue... oh, whatever. This one wasn't related to his past mercenary activities. He worked as a handyman at Stone Creek Apartments and used his access to the suites to steal checkbooks. He eventually got caught because of a traffic accident, which wasn't even his fault. When the police searched his car, they found counterfeit checks and papers detailing his plans to move to an island in the Caribbean. On his arrest documents, he listed his occupation as mercenary. Operation Red Dog, Chapter 12. The End of Mike Perdue. The judge sent Perdue to prison for 6 years, but he was soon out again, and he wasn't done. On September 11, 1987, a woman called the ATF office in Houston and said she had overheard Perdue talking about a shipment of weapons, including assault rifles and plastic explosives, being sent from Houston to Florida. The weapons were shipped via rail to the Miami area, supposedly for some sort of an adventure in the Caribbean. Perdue eventually turned up in Utah, where he was admitted to a hospital. He had HIV and his organs were shutting down. By the time his family got to Salt Lake City, he was already in a coma, being kept alive by the hospital machines. The family decided it was best to let him die. His obituary made no mention of his mercenary career, instead calling him a self-employed over-the-road truck driver. Several years later, the new owner of his house in Houston dug up a handgun in the garden. Nearly 20 years after the failed coup, Wolfgang Draghi was quoted in the Canadian press as saying that the objectives were completely achievable. "We had men and resources," he said. "It was just unfortunate that we got caught. But jail wasn't that bad. It really put American society and the racial issue into perspective. Plus, it gave me an opportunity to network with other racialist leaders, which really helped me after I got out." For Draghi, doing jail time was like going through rep grind in World of Warcraft. The leaders of various far-right organizations were very impressed with him, believing that Draghi could have talked to save his skin, but chose to maintain silence. After doing time, he worked as a taxi driver in Vancouver, but when the police department revoked his license, Draghi decided to return to the United States. He was barred from entering the country, but Draghi was a slippery creature, and he managed to get in undetected and make his way to Minnesota, where he had friends. With the help of his prison connections, he started selling cocaine and marijuana to dealers. He justified this by telling people he was only doing it to help the far-right movement. "I was intending to raise large amounts so I could support the cause I believe in," he said. "You know, for instance, if I knew people needed money for political goals, or if I felt they had a worthwhile project, well, I would give them a few $100 or maybe even a couple of $1,000. Yeah, regularly. I was making like $6,000–7,000 a week." Within a year of his release from prison, Draghi was mixing with the most extreme fringe of the North American neo-Nazi movement. The Order was a white supremacist terrorist organization active in the United States between September 1983 and December 1984. The short-lived organization was founded by Robert J. Matthews, who previously formed the Sons of Liberty, an anti-communist militia mostly made up of Mormon survivalists and religious fundamentalists.
The Sons of Liberty!
The Order was essentially the closest thing to a real-life version of what a typical GTA protagonist does. They did armed robberies and racketeering, ran a counterfeiting operation, assassinated their political opponents, participated in shootouts with cops, robbed banks and armored cars, taking a total of $4.1 million. The proceeds of these robberies were distributed to leaders of sympathetic far-right entities. The Order managed to innovate the neo-Nazi discourse in a few very important ways. In December 1984, the New York Times published an article about the Order and their activities. According to the newspaper, the crimes were conducted to raise money for a war against the United States government, which the group calls ZOG, or Zionist Occupation Government. The concept of ZOG was invented by an American neo-Nazi Eric Thompson back in 1976, but this was how the term first came to the attention of a larger audience. The second big Nazi innovation that remains relevant even to this day were the 14 words, or 1488. The slogan was originally coined by David Lane, who was among the 9 founding members of the Order. The 8s represent the 8th letter of the alphabet, H, and HH stands for Heil Hitler. Sometime later, Draghi was arrested by the FBI. Although the arrest was reported in the press as simple drug and weapons case, declassified records show that the domestic terrorism unit of the terrorism section at FBI headquarters was also involved. The FBI had linked Draghi to the Aryan nations. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 13 years at Lampag Prison in California. By the time he was paroled in April 21, 1989, Draghi was 40 years old. He was broke. All he had were his contacts in the far right. Fed up with Don Andrews, he wanted to form his own movement. Draghi's idea was to unite the Canadian extremists in a single organization. He was going to call it the Society for the Preservation of the White Race, but later he came up with the White Heritage Front. In accordance with Wolfgang's vision, the organization consisted of 2 wings. The political wing would engage in propaganda, leafleting, and lobbying. The covert wing would do the dirty work. They would harass race traders, raise money by robbing armored cars and black drug dealers. In addition to that, Draghi planned to make money by selling information on Canadian Jewish groups to the Libyan government, but that didn't pan out. On April 14, 2005, Draghi was shot dead by a junkie called Keith. It was 3 p.m. Wolfgang was not wearing any pants. He didn't feel like putting them on. Keith Deroux was a lost and confused young man. After killing the drug dealer, instead of fleeing the crime scene, he ran back into Draghi's apartment and hid in the closet. He drank 2 of Wolfgang's beers, snorted a lot of cocaine, called his brother, and then dialed 911. When the police got there, he refused to come out of the closet and claimed he had a hostage. So, what happened to the warlock? Remember Sir Gary the sorcerer, the ufologist who got deposed in a leftist coup in Grenada? The man who deposed him, Maurice Bishop, headed the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada for 4 years. Then he suffered a coup of his own, a counter-coup. He was dismissed from his post and shot by a militarist hardliner Bernard Cord, who subsequently suffered a counter-coup and got deposed by General Hudson Austin. These events triggered the American intervention, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury. The United States invasion of Grenada in 1983 resulted in American victory within a matter of days. After years in exile, Sir Gary was finally able to return home. At last, the warlocracy could finally compete on the free marketplace of ideas. Unfortunately, it failed. His party lost the elections, winning 36% of the popular vote, but only a single seat in the House of Representatives. Attempts by Gary and his party to return to power in 1990 and 1995 were also unsuccessful. He died a few years later in Grand'Ansay, Grenada. What happened to Patrick John? He claimed victimhood, says the Americans tricked him. He didn't realize these were bad people with an intent to take over the island. All he wanted to do was to engage in minor corruption, do some quid pro quo. He thought he was agreeing to purchase a printing press for the Labour Party offices from Perdue. Following his release from prison, John, formerly a member of the national football team, became a local football administrator. In 1992, he was elected president of the Dominica Football Association. But being true to himself, John engaged in shady activities. In November 2011, he was banned by FIFA from the sport for 2 years for his part in a bribery scheme involving FIFA presidential candidate Mohammed bin Hammam. This series of videos is based on the work of Stuart Bell, a journalist and the author of an incredibly detailed book about the operation. In Bell's view, Operation Red Dog was Mike Perdue's ultimate get-rich scam. He scammed Patrick John and the officers of the Dominican Defense Force into believing he was a veteran mercenary who could get the job done. He scammed his recruits into believing they were fighting communism. Some of them, perhaps most of them, thought they were taking part in a CIA-sanctioned operation. If it had all worked out, Perdue would have been a millionaire with his own island, a crook's paradise. Operation Red Dog had several important consequences. For one, it led to a series of events that ended up wiping out the violent Canadian far-right. Ontario used to be a hotbed for white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, Toronto's Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Resistance Movement, and the Edmund Burke Society. While the Caribbean adventure did provide Draghi with social clout, it also allowed Canadian intelligence to brand him a national security threat and make him a target of a state surveillance and disruption campaign. The undercover intelligence investigation not only managed to bring down Draghi, it also discredited his entire network. James McQuarter, the Grand Wizard of the Canadian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, renounced white supremacy and apologized for his racist past. He wrote the book Realm of Wealth, The 9 Circles of Prosperity, and embarked on a career as a speaker and marketeer of his own financial self-help program. The Realm of Wealth brings ancient prosperity cycles into your hands. Find out why, in the midst of the information age, these cycles are even more powerful. How to apply the cycles of prosperity as anti-aging methods. The prosperity tool used by Da Vinci that is neglected in the 21st century. Master the same power that launched Thomas Edison and Colonel Sanders. Jesus Christ, maybe he should have stayed in the Klan. Operation Red Dog indirectly led to the emergence of a phenomenon that I call WN 1.5. Modern activists distinguish between the contemporary far-right, with memes and jokes, and the old-style white nationalism, the so-called WN 1.0. These were violent Nazis who intended to overthrow the US government by force. An archetypal example of WN 1.0 culture would be James Mason, a neo-Nazi intellectual and strategist. Mason is the author of a newsletter titled Siege, sometimes in all capital letters. It eventually got re-edited and published as a book. Siege is best described as Alinsky's Rules for Radicals meets Hitler's Mein Kampf. Mason was very impressed with Operation Red Dog, at least initially. He called it the KKK D-Day, a first encouraging baby step that failed for reasons easily corrected. He thought that the real problem with the operation was that the mercs were not violent enough. Why should 10 men with automatic weapons about to leave the United States by boat be arrested? How could they be arrested unless they themselves decided in their own minds to let themselves be arrested, writes Mason. Instead of the end of a right-wing mission, it should have been the beginning of a revolutionary one. It could have begun right there, on the pier. Mike Perdue failed to enter the race war mindset, you see. This approach is contrasted with modern white nationalism. Activists and writers like Greg Johnson disavow violence and are more focused on the culture war, propaganda, rhetoric, taking advantage of social media and technology. This mindset is sometimes referred to as WN 2.0. In popular media, both of these ideologies are called white nationalist. In many cases, this is their self-description. But as you can see, there is a stark difference between the two. The lost missing link, the entity that combines some of the elements of both approaches to white nationalism, is a neo-Nazi web forum, stormfront.org. The creation of this website was another unintentional side effect of Perdue's misadventure in the Caribbean. Don Black served 3 years in federal prison for his role in the Dominican invasion plot. While in prison, he took classes in computer programming. You can say that Don Black learned how to code Uh-oh. Truly, education is the elixir of growth. Once out of jail, he began dabbling with his computer, eventually setting up a dial-up bulletin board service for the radical right. Over time, that service evolved into Stormfront.org, America's first ever hate site, launched in 1995. The internet is a perfect medium for dissemination of the far-right message. It allowed white nationalists to bypass the traditional media and various political restrictions, as well as social taboos. It made possible for people to interact with far-right ideas in the privacy of their own homes, without fear of embarrassment. It allowed the neo-Nazis to reach new audiences. And for a while, the user base was growing at an impressive rate. In 2002, Stormfront had 5,000 registered accounts. A year later, membership reached 11,000, not counting the lurkers. By 2008, there were more than 133,000 users on the site. Oh shit, oh fuck! At this rate of expansion in a few years, everyone in the West, and possibly on Earth, will be a Nazi! Well, about that. At the moment of recording, Stormfront.org has less than 400,000 non-unique visits every month. For comparison, Radlib Rational Wiki has more than 2 million. CentristVox.com has around 31 million. The New York Times has 243 million. I hope this puts things into perspective. The reality is that the white nationalist message, especially in its crude form, is just not very popular. Today, whatever remains of WN 1.5 culture exists in form of cringy Gen X white nationalists with online handles like Solid Snake.
No! That is not Solid Snake!
In 2008, it was revealed that Black's wife, Chloe, works as an executive assistant for sugar baron Jose Fanjul. Her job duties included acting as a spokesperson for a charter school to lift underprivileged Black and Hispanic children out of poverty. Despite its cultural significance for the far right, Stormfront always struggled to pay its bills. All those years that Don posted how much was needed to run the site, and all the months Stormfront didn't receive enough donations, that difference was made up from Chloe Black's income, says one of the community members. Dominica remains among the least developed islands in the Caribbean. Attempts were made to diversify the economy away from over-reliance on bananas. Tropical storm Erika devastated the island in August 2015, but the worst was yet to come. Maria, a Category 5 hurricane, was the worst natural disaster in recorded history to affect the island. Downing all cellular, radio, and internet services, Maria effectively cut Dominica off from the outside world. A catastrophic 90% of the buildings on the island had been damaged. The infrastructure was in ruins. There was no power. The scale of destruction left most Dominicans homeless and desperate. It's not clear how many reside in Dominica today. According to one source, the number might be as low as 45,000. Thanks for watching.
I wanna jam it with you, with jamming, and I hope you like jamming too. And the rules they go by, we can do is anyhow. I and I will see you through, 'cause every day we pay the price. Sacrifice, jam until the jam is through. We're jamming. The thing that jamming was a thing of the past.